Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. So today we're looking at Des heilgen Geistes, reiche Gnad, which translates to the rich grace of the Holy Spirit. Fairly straightforward chorale, a couple of quirks here and there, but we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So one flat in the key signature, we start on D minor, we end on D major. I reckon the overall tonality of the chorale is D minor. After our tonic triad, we have some passing tones in the lower voices. F, A, and D is just taking D minor and inverting it, so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral, just change the figured bass. Neighbor tones in the lower voices before we get F, A, D, and D. Same chord as before. This D is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. C sharp, A, E, and A is 5-6, A major over C sharp. A little passing seventh here. Actually, let me comment on something. It looks like there's a suspension happening here, and 6/5 suspensions are technically a thing, right? I guess you can theoretically suspend any two intervals over a certain fixed point. But I think because there are two constants, it's really up to you whether or not this is a 5-6 chord or a 5-6-5. It's fairly negligible. But that resolves where we would expect D minor, D, F, D, and A, which is our tonic. Another passing tone here in the tenor. And then we have F sharp, D, A, and A. This is D major over F sharp, so here we see 5-6 of 4, where our tonic is operating as the dominant of the subdominant. And that resolves where we would expect G minor, G, D, A, and B flat. And in typical Bach fashion, he has a 9/8 suspension over the bass in the alto. That's still implying our 4 chord though. Another passing tone in the bass before we get B flat, D, G, and B flat, which is just taking our chord, and similar to our first measure, we're just taking G minor and inverting it before we get it back in root position again. This F sharp's a little curious though. I don't know really what it's doing there. Kind of makes it feel like we're preparing for a half cadence in the key of G minor, but Bach very quickly pivots back to the idea of D minor by using F natural here rather than F sharp. If this were an F sharp, I would say this were a half cadence, especially because the fifth of the chord is in the melody, but this is an imperfect authentic cadence or an unusual half cadence where we have a minor dominant, but I think that's kind of unlikely. Regardless, G minor in root position here, and then after this 4/3 suspension we finally get our imperfect authentic cadence. Or, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. This is not an imperfect authentic cadence. Let's walk that back. This is a plagal cadence where we have 4 going to 1. A very long idea of 4 going to 1. It's interesting that Bach chooses to tonicize 4 here. And also a little hints at a little tonicization here as well of G minor, especially because in the next phrase we're going to get a mid-phrase modulation to G minor, or at least what I analyze as a mid-phrase modulation to G minor. So we start the phrase off with D minor, D, A, F, and F. If this were D major, it'd make a little bit more sense, but this is just a little variation on what I guess would be the most normative approach. And here's our pivot point where we're going to move towards G minor here, right? Because we have E natural, C, E, and G. This D is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and this F is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. So we get C major over E, which is 7/6, subtonic 7/6, which is going to be our pivot to the key of G minor, which is actually 4/6. And the reason why I think this is a modulation and not just a tonicization, or furthermore staying in the key of D minor, and this is just 7/6 going to 5 of 4 going to 4, is because of the fact that we have melodic minor here in the bass, and it just sounds like we're in the key of G minor for this little section. So it's interesting that he alludes to G minor here, spends a long time actually developing G minor in this measure, and then modulating to G minor for a brief period of time in the next phrase. But after our 4/6, we get F sharp, C, E flat, and A. We could call this 7/7. I think that that's totally valid. F sharp fully diminished. Or I think this E flat's, even though this is an E natural, it looks like this E flat's kind of like a 7/6 suspension over the bass. Whether that's coincidental or not, I don't know, but I'm going to call this 5/6/5. And typically when we see this ascending configuration of melodic minor, I think that 4 going to 5 occurs. I guess it occurs more frequently than 4 going to 7 when we see it in this configuration here where we have melodic minor, like I just said. But the chords function the same. It's really anyone's guess as to what chord's being implied here. They both exist. They're only a half step away from one another in terms of their pitch content, so basically flip a coin on that one. We do resolve to G minor though, G, B flat, D, and B flat, which is our tonic, and also our gateway to the key of F. I know this modulation looks very small. I think that, you know, when we have this C major chord here and we have melodic minor in the bass, it just really looks like G minor here, and it's just a small modulation. That's how I look at it. I think you could analyze this in the key of D minor, but with the melody looking the way that it does, right, G, A, B flat, and the bass looking the way it does, E natural, F sharp, G, the outer voices really drive the fact that G minor is being implied here home. So G minor also happens to be 2 in the key of F. We have a passing tone in the tenor here before we get C, G, E, and B flat, another C major based chord, but in this case it is our 5 chord with that minor 7th on the outside, so 5, 7, passing tones in the alto and the bass before we get E, C, G, and B flat. That's just taking our chord and inverting it, so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And then we get F major, F, C, G, and A in typical Bach fashion with that 9/8 suspension in the alto. It's our tonic triad. We then go to B flat, D, F, and G. It's G minor 7 over B flat. Bach loves 2-6-5 chords in cadential context especially. That moves to 5, C, C, E, and G. A little anticipation in the melody here. Delayed passing 7th here in the tenor, before our perfect authentic cadence in the key of F major, where we have a 1 chord, F, A, C, and F. Okay, moving ahead, we have a half cadence in the key of D minor, and we modulate somewhere here. As you could see on the page, we start to get C sharps after the first complete measure, so I would reckon the modulation's happening somewhere in this vicinity. But we start off with a 5 chord C major, C, C, E, and G, which we would expect to resolve to some type of tonic chord, which it does, F, C, F, and A, which is F major, passing tone in the bass, A, C, F, and A. It's just taking our tonic triad and rotating it, so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Another passing tone in the bass, and then we get C major again, C, C, E, and G, and I think this begins the point in which we could analyze a modulation. Of course, actually, no, I'm going to take that back. We could analyze the modulation happening, you know, over this F major chord as well, because F major and D minor, they're relative to one another. They share a lot of notes in common. One might even say they share all of their notes in common, which means that they have a lot of common chords as well. So for me, the modulation feels like it's happening somewhere on this beat. That's the way that I hear it, because we hear the C sharp afterwards, and that's typically indicative of the fact that a modulation happens afterwards. Not necessarily the fact, or that's not always necessarily true, but for most intents and purposes, that's the MO that I choose to abide by. So we have some passing tones going on here in the bass and the alto, and in anticipation as well in the tenor, D, B flat, D, and G. I think this is going to be kind of weird, but I slowed this section down, and this is where I really hear the modulation happening, and I think it's further justified by what's happening on the next and I'll talk about it when I get there. But D, B flat, D, and G spells G minor over D, which is 2-6-4. Some transitive harmony happening over this passing chord here, but I think we're modulating over this passing chord, and we're moving to the key of D minor through a 4-6-4 chord. And the reason why that feels significant is because we have a series of dominant functioning chords in sequence. Pardon me. I need to be careful using the word sequence, but a series of dominant functioning chords happening. I was about to say sequentially. Oh my goodness, what am I saying? One after the other is basically what I'm trying to say. E, B flat, C sharp, and G is 7-6-5. C sharp fully diminished 7th over E. And then if we ignore these passing tones here for a second, we're just going to analyze the downbeats real quick. C sharp, A, E, and G is 5-6-5, which is A7 over C sharp. passing tone in the tenor, and then we have A, C sharp, E, and A, which is just taking our chord, removing the 7th and putting it in root position, so we'll just change the figure bass. So we have a measure here that consists entirely of dominant chords and will eventually resolve like we would expect to a tonic functioning triad. But the reason why I feel like these passing tones are important, I think there are two ways to interpret it. I'm going to use an arrow here because it gets a little crammed real estate-wise if I try to fit everything here. So for starters, if we look at all of the notes that, if we were to spell a chord on this beat, we have D, B flat, D, and G, which is G minor over D, another 4/6/4 chord in the key of D minor. We have a chord that interrupts the progression between two light chords, right? 5 and 7, they're a third apart, they share a function, not too different from one another. There's not really a progression happening here per se, but more so a prolongation of the idea that the leading tone is present, there's dominance going on here, and Bach is eventually going to resolve that tension. But when we look at the role that the 4 chord is playing, it's interrupting the two light chords, which is significant because it kind of, I guess, clarifies or reinforces the point that there really isn't a very strong progression happening between 7 and 5 because the chords are so similar. So whether you look at these Ds as resolutions to the tonic, which is D minor, or whether you look at the whole picture and see a 4 chord interrupting the 7 going to 5, I feel like it's significant even though it's a 2-note or 2-voice progression of chords between 7 and 5. Just something that I've been noticing a bit more with chords, especially chords that are a third apart. Typically the subdivided progression will occur. But we do get the resolution I was talking about earlier here, D minor, D, A, E, and F. And in typical Bach style, we get that 9/8 suspension over the bass, especially with the D minor chord. This is our tonic. Passing tone in the bass, F, A, D, and F is just taking our chord and inverting it, first inversion. And we see a very similar profile to the first phrase. We'll probably see, you could probably liken this first system to this second system here as like A, B, A prime, B prime if you're doing a formal analysis. So neighboring leading tone here, G sharp, B, D, and F is G sharp fully diminished 7th, which is 7, 7 of 5, because G sharp is the leading tone to A, and A is our 5. And just like how this plagal cadence really could have felt like a half cadence in the key of G minor, this is the half cadence that I feel like the first section, the A section, could have had. We have another 4/3 suspension this time in the alto, and something that isn't really a suspension, but I guess B going down to A could be a 7/6 suspension, and this E could be like a lower ornament that interrupts that. But we do get the resolution to 5 here, A, C sharp, and E. And our next phrase concludes with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D and no modulations. So we are continuing to analyze in the key of D minor. We start the phrase off with D minor over F, F, A, D, and D, which is 1/6. Passing tone in the bass before we get D, A, and E. This D is an accented non-chord tone, and really it's the C sharp that is our bass. C sharp, A, and E is our 5/6 chord, A major over C sharp, and that resolves to D minor, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad and root position. We then have D, B flat, E, and G, which is E minor 7 flat 5 over D, in other words 2/4/2, and we know how this will resolve. This will resolve a 5th below, which is to 5, and in first inversion, so some type of 5/6 chord, C sharp, A, E, and G, which is not just 5/6, but also 5/6/5. Neighbor tone in the bass and a delayed neighbor tone in the alto before we get the same chord again, A, E, and G. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. C sharp, A, E, and G. Same chord, no need to reanalyze. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it as well. And then we're closing in on our cadence, D, A, E, and F, typical Bach with the 9/8 suspension over the bass. This is D minor in root position, D, A, D, and F. We then get G, B flat, D, and E, another E minor 7 flat 5 chord. You know, Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords in first inversion, and then especially in cadential contexts. And then we get 5, A, C sharp, and E, which is A major, our tonic triad, our dominant triad, delayed passing 7th in the tenor here, anticipation in the melody. You probably recognize this cadence from the second phrase because they're very similar to each other in terms of their character. The melody is very similar and the form takes that same shape as well before we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad. This is our tonic triad, but major because we are at the end of a minor chorale, and Bach often does that with minor chorales. But that's today's analysis. Not too much to write home about, fairly straightforward, all things considered. A couple of interesting things, you know, the fact that I hear the modulation happening on the end of a beat is pretty unusual. We do have a mid-phrase modulation here, or a potential mid-phrase modulation. If you don't hear this as being a fragment in the key of G minor, totally fine. I totally understand. The first time I listened to it, it sounded like it was just in D minor the entire time. But G minor makes a little bit more sense after a couple more listens and explains the E flat and the F sharp as well. Other than that, we see our tonic functioning as 5 of 4 here. It's not as big of a deal in minor chorales since the chord gets changed to major in the first place, but still something to take note of to draw the comparison between what is done in major keys in comparison to minor keys. Other than that, all the harmony is more or less functional and nothing that I wouldn't expect from a chorale. So if you want to follow me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.